In the heartland of America, where the fields stretch endlessly and small towns hold tight to their traditions, a chilling tale of identity, love, and tragedy began to unfold. Today, we're recapping the triple murder that inspired the Oscar-winning movie Boys Don't Cry. Around 10 a.m. on New Year's Eve in 1993, Anna Mae Lambert arrived at her daughter Lisa's farmhouse near Humboldt, Nebraska. 23-year-old Lisa was the type of sweet girl who never met a person she didn't want to save. There was always somebody renting her extra room or staying on her couch for a few nights. She worked as a nurse's aide at a local nursing home, and sometimes when she needed extra cash, she poured drinks at Big Mike's bar in town. But her most important job was being both mom and dad to her 9-month-old son. So when Anna Mae drove up her daughter's driveway and saw the front door wide open and not a soul around, she knew right away something was wrong. Leaving your door open in the freezing cold Nebraska winter was not just weird, it was downright dangerous. And if there was one thing Lisa Lambert would never do, it's put her baby boy in danger. Lisa's farmhouse was at least a quarter mile from the main road. The only sound around was the baby crying inside. But when Anna Mae walked in the door, she could see she wasn't alone, like she thought she was. A strange man was in the living room sitting on the floor by the couch. She knocked a couple of times on the open door, but he didn't move a muscle. In her heart, she knew this didn't bode well, but she didn't have time to be afraid. Her grandson needed her, so she just kept right on going to Lisa's bedroom where the little boy's crib was. She didn't dare even glance at her daughter's bed until she had the baby in her arms. Only when she was holding him tight did she take a deep breath and turn around. Lisa's waterbed had been popped like a balloon. Laying in a puddle on top of it was her daughter. She'd been shot twice in the face, execution style. And she wasn't alone. Someone else was sprawled across the foot of the bed, a person everyone in town knew as Brandon Teena, a 21-year-old man from Lincoln. Now he was dead, shot in the head and stabbed. Little did Anna Mae know that the deaths of these 3 people would make headlines around the world. Not just because it was a brutal murder in a small town where murder, brutal or otherwise, just didn't happen, but mostly because of Brandon, the new guy in town. Brandon Teena was born Teena Renee Brandon in December 1972. Back then, the word transgender didn't exist in anyone's vocabulary. Instead, Brandon's family called him a tomboy. He liked jeans, not dresses. He cut his hair short and played with snakes instead of dolls. And he went by the name Billy, not Teena. His family didn't know what to do with him. His father was dead, his mother Joanne was only a teenager herself, and she already had one child running around, a 3-year-old girl named Tammy. The little family of 3 lived in a trailer park in Lincoln, Nebraska. Joanne did the best she could, but even with a job working retail, she struggled to pay the bills. Brandon and Tammy bounced between family members while their mother worked. At least one of those people, an uncle, sexually violated both of them. By high school, Brandon had long ago accepted the fact that he just didn't feel like a girl. So he switched his name around and started going by Brandon Teena instead of Teena Brandon. Unfortunately, no one else wanted to play along. His mother refused to call him Brandon. His sister just thought the whole thing was weird, and his Catholic high school expelled him 3 days before graduation. He took a shot at joining the military, but he lost his chance after he failed the written exam. The question he got wrong was about his gender. He listed himself as male instead of female. The only thing he was really great at was wooing the ladies. Brandon was quite the ladies' man. Most of his conquests didn't even know he was trans, but whining and dining his many girlfriends cost money. More money than Brandon's odd jobs brought in. So he took to forging checks and stealing ATM cards to pay his bills. By November 1993, just before his 21st birthday, Brandon's outlaw life was catching up to him. He was out on probation, but still doing the same old things to get by, and the Lincoln Police Department was sick of seeing his face in court. After yet another felony arrest, this time for forging a withdrawal slip at a local bank, Brandon was looking at real prison time. So he picked up and fled 100 miles northeast to Humboldt, Nebraska. He knew a friend of a friend who had a line on a place to stay there, an old farmhouse out in the middle of nowhere. The girl who lived there, Lisa Lambert, was nice. She wouldn't mind an extra guest as long as it was just temporary. So that's how Brandon came to town. Then he fell in love. Her name was Lana Tisdale. At 18 years old, Lana had never been out of Falls City, Nebraska, and Brandon was as smooth and charming as someone out of a movie. He came off like a bad boy with a heart of gold. He was a die-hard romantic, the kind of person who made big gestures with flowers and jewelry. Lana ate it up. Except she didn't know Brandon was trans. No one did. In mid-December 1993, about 2 weeks after they met, he moved his stuff into Lana's room. She still lived with her mother, Linda, and her older sister, Leslie. And here's where the story gets complicated. Lana's house was a crash pad, the kind of place where friends of friends felt comfortable enough to stop by, have a few drinks, and spend the night. But two couples were always there keeping the party going that December. Lana Tisdale and Brandon, and Leslie Tisdale and her boyfriend, 22-year-old Philip Devine. Leslie and Philip fell in love a couple of months earlier in a Job Corps in Iowa where Philip lived. He came to Nebraska to spend the holidays with Leslie. Rounding out the party most nights were two small-time hoods, 22-year-old John Lauder and 21-year-old Tom Nissen. John and Lana had known each other since they were kids, and they dated on and off. Tom was married, but he was also sort of seeing Lana's aunt, which is how he came to meet the whole crew. John and Tom quickly became drinking buddies. The two of them had a lot in common. They both grew up in and out of juvenile detention and prison, and they both had a long history with the law. John for breaking into homes and stealing things. Tom was heavy into starting fires. And most importantly, for the purposes of this story, they both believed Brandon was a guy. But the whole house of cards was about to come crashing down. Shortly before midnight on November 27th, Brandon got a ticket for having an open bottle of booze in the car. When the cops asked for ID, Brandon handed over his cousin's license with the name Charles Brayman. On December 15th, Brandon showed up in court still using the name Charles Brayman. It should have been pretty cut and dried. He pled not guilty to the open container charge and walked out, but he didn't get farther than the parking lot before a police officer caught up to him. You see, Brandon had been up to his old tricks again. He had cashed 3 bad checks in Falls City, which got the Lincoln Police Department involved, and at the end of it, the bank teller picked a picture of Brandon out of a photo lineup. This time, he couldn't bluff his way out of the charges using his cousin's ID. They knew his name was actually Teena Brandon, and that's how Brandon's double life started to unravel. On December 22nd, when Lana came down to the station to bail him out, she didn't understand why Brandon was in the female wing. Meanwhile, the local newspaper ran a story about Brandon's arrest. They outed him as Teena Brandon to his new friends. In the film Boys Don't Cry, Lana Tisdale's character keeps dating Brandon after the story breaks. However, the real Lana Tisdale says that didn't happen, and she sued Fox Searchlight Pictures over it. She claimed she stopped dating Brandon, but they kept in touch. But Lana's issues were the least of Brandon's problems. After the story in the paper outed him, Linda kicked Brandon out of Lana's room. He couldn't go back to Lisa's house because she was still angry with him for decamping to Lana's place, so he ended up sleeping on Tom Nissen's couch. Then Tom decided to have a Christmas Eve party. The whole crowd was invited, including Leslie and Lana, Philip Devine, John Lauder, and Brandon. Brandon thought he'd managed to smooth the whole Teena thing over. He told Lana he was in the process of a sex change, but it wasn't finished yet, so that's why the police still thought he was a female. She told him they could still be friends, but Brandon laid on the charm. Unfortunately, John and Tom had a few too many drinks and decided they were going to see what was what for themselves. They grabbed Brandon and pulled down his pants. They forced him to show the party guests, especially Lana, his female genitals. Then they took it farther. After everyone else left, they dragged Brandon into John's car and drove him out to a meatpacking plant just outside of town. Both men assaulted and gang raped Brandon in the back seat. Then they drove back to Tom's house and forced Brandon to shower. That's when he escaped out of the window and fled to Lana's house. Lana begged Brandon to file a police report, but Brandon said they threatened to silence him permanently if he told the cops. But Lana persisted. The police couldn't protect Brandon if they didn't know what was happening. Unfortunately, the Richardson County Sheriff, Charles Law, didn't take the story seriously. He was more concerned with the way Brandon had managed to pass as a man rather than the two people who attacked him. Meanwhile, Tom and John were on the hunt. Lana's mother had called to tell them Brandon talked to the police despite their threats. Armed with rope and a hatchet, they set out to find him. First, they dropped by his mother's house in Lincoln. Brandon wasn't there. They checked 3 more places they found listed in Brandon's address book. Little did they know, the sheriff couldn't care less. 3 days after the rape, Sheriff Law caught up with John and Tom. He questioned them about the assault, but they denied everything, and he didn't make an arrest. John and Tom didn't think their luck would hold. They fully believed it was just a matter of time before they went back to prison on the rape charges, and they weren't about to go down quietly. They wanted Brandon to pay for going to the police, for making them believe he was a guy, and for somehow managing to date Lana, one of the hottest girls in town. And the plan they came up with was brutal. They talked about luring Brandon away, tying him up, and lopping off his hands and head. That way, nobody would be able to identify his corpse. But first, they had to find him. Unfortunately, it was a really small town. Brandon was supposed to come back to the police station on December 30th to talk about those bad checks. When he showed up, he saw Tom in the parking lot and hightailed it out of there. That night, John and Tom drove to Lana Tisdale's house looking for Brandon. He wasn't there, but Lana's mother said they could find him at Lisa Lambert's place. John reportedly said he felt like killing someone and then left. Neither Lana nor her mom knew what that meant. Still, they didn't call Lisa to warn her they were coming. John and Tom broke into Lisa Lambert's house around 1 a.m. on December 31st, 1993. They were hell-bent on finding Brandon. They found Lisa in bed and demanded to know where Brandon was. She kept her mouth shut. Tom tore the house apart looking for Brandon. He finally found him hiding under a blanket at the foot of her bed. Meanwhile, John asked Lisa if there was anyone else in the house. There was. Philip Devine was there too. Leslie Tisdale had broken up with him, so Lisa told him he could stay at her place while he waited for his mom to send money for a bus ticket back to Iowa. None of them lived to see the new year. John shot Brandon in the stomach. When they noticed he was still twitching, Tom grabbed a knife and stabbed him through the chest. For good measure, Tom and John murdered Lisa and Philip too. The only person to survive the slaughter was Lisa's 8-month-old baby, left alone to cry in his crib. Both men fled the scene and tossed their gloves and weapons into a frozen river. Unfortunately for them, the knife was still in a sheath marked with John Lauder's name. And since Brandon had just filed charges against them, it wasn't hard to follow the trail back to John and Tom. They were both arrested later that afternoon. Tom flipped, saying he watched John shoot Brandon, Lisa, and Philip. He told police where they could find the gun and gloves in exchange for a lighter sentence. He ended up with life in prison. John tried to discredit Tom's story, but the jury didn't believe him. He was sentenced to death. The appeals process dragged out long enough for Nebraska to abolish the death penalty in 2015. Instead, John Lauder will spend the rest of his life in jail. Joanne Brandon sued the Richardson County Sheriff's Department for the wrongful death of her child. She believed Sheriff Law failed to protect Brandon by not investigating his rape claims. The Nebraska Supreme Court agreed. They believed Sheriff Law laid an essential link in the chain that led to the victim's death. In the end, Joanne won $80,000 and another $6,200 to cover funeral costs. But even after all of this, she refused to acknowledge Brandon's chosen gender identity. To this day, Brandon is buried in a grave marked Teena R. Brandon, daughter, sister, and friend. In 1999, Hilary Swank won an Oscar for portraying Brandon in Boys Don't Cry. Strangely, the movie left out the part about Philip Devine's murder. As for Lana Tisdale, she wasn't at all happy about the movie being made, and she hated how actress Chloe Sevigny played her. She even petitioned her hometown theater not to show it, but didn't make much headway. In 2001, she got married and moved to Kansas. And that's the true story behind Boys Don't Cry. Thanks for watching this recap. Until next time, goodbye. And that's your recap.
Thanks for hanging out with us today.
If you like getting all the crime in half the time, go ahead and tap that subscribe button and the bell so you never miss a story.
We're here Wednesdays, Saturdays, and Sundays, but don't go away. Catch up on more recaps right here, right now.
Until next time, take care.